Imagine a scene. Late evening. Jerusalem slowly sinks into silence. The streets are almost empty. In the narrow alleys, only the footsteps of those hurrying home can be heard. A small room, a simple wooden table. 13 people sit around this table. This is the Last Supper. The atmosphere seems calm. Bread lies on the table. A cup of wine stands nearby. The disciples talk among themselves. Some recall the events of recent days. But Jesus remains silent. He looks at those sitting next to him, at the people who have walked with him day after day for 3 years. They left their homes, their work, their old lives. They witnessed things most people never see. They saw the blind suddenly begin to see light. They saw the paralyzed rise and begin to walk. They saw storms on the sea suddenly calm at his word. They heard every parable he told, about seeds falling into the soil, about the lost sheep, about the Good Samaritan. They listened to every sermon he delivered, words about love, about forgiveness, about the kingdom of God. And many times it seemed to them that they were standing on the threshold of something great, that history was about to change. And then Jesus speaks a phrase that makes the air in the room feel heavier. The words are quiet, but they fall into the silence like a stone into water. Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. For several seconds, the room is completely still. The disciples look at one another. Someone stops moving. Someone freezes, a cup in hand. No one understands what is happening, but suddenly the tension becomes palpable, and one by one they begin to ask, "Lord, is it I?" "Surely not I." Their voices are soft, almost a whisper. Each tries to figure out whom Jesus meant. No one looks at Judas, not a single one. No one suspects him. No one says, "Perhaps it's him." For 3 years, Judas Iscariot had appeared no different from the other 11. He ate at the same table, traveled the same roads, heard the same words, prayed alongside them, even more. He was entrusted with the group's money, the treasury, what is usually entrusted only to someone completely trusted, which means the other disciples trusted him. They saw him as reliable. But the Gospel of John mentions that sometimes he used that money for himself, and no one noticed. Sometimes the most dangerous person is not an obvious enemy, but the one who seems completely right, and yet he was the one who handed Jesus over to his enemies for 30 pieces of silver, the amount that at that time could buy a slave. And here arises a question that chills the mind. How can someone be so close to God, hear his voice, see his miracles, live beside him, and still remain so far from him? And an even more personal question, perhaps an uncomfortable one. Could it happen to any of us? There is one detail in Judas's story that most people almost never notice. A small historical detail. But once understood, the whole story begins to look a little different. Judas was the only disciple of Jesus who was not a Galilean. Peter, Andrew, James, John, Matthew. They were all from Galilee. They grew up in the same towns and villages, spoke with the same Galilean accent, shared the same culture, similar habits, similar ways of thinking. They were one of us. When they joked, they understood each other. When they spoke, they heard familiar tones. When they argued, they remained part of the same circle. But Judas was different. He was from the city of Kerioth in southern Judea, from another region, from a different cultural background. Sometimes such a difference seems minor, but when you are the only one in the group who is slightly different, the feeling can be completely different. You become more observant. You watch how the others behave, listen to the words they use. When they laugh, when they are silent, when they say the right spiritual phrases, and gradually you begin to adjust. Learn to say the right words, laugh at the right moments, react as everyone else reacts. And after a while, it starts to look completely natural. So natural that no one notices the difference anymore. From the outside, you appear to be part of the group, one of them. That's exactly what happened with Judas. He learned to look like a disciple. He walked beside Jesus. He heard the same sermons, prayed with the others, traveled with them. But to look like a disciple and to be a disciple are not always the same thing, because true change doesn't happen on the outside. It begins in the heart. And here Judas's story raises a very uncomfortable question, a question that is easy to ask someone else, but much harder to ask yourself. How many people today know when to say amen, when to lift their hands in prayer, when to speak the right spiritual words, when to appear especially devout, yet remain completely different inside? How many people have learned the language of faith, but never allowed it to change their hearts? Judas did not look like a villain. No disciple suspected him. No one pointed at him. He was not a monster. He was a person who had learned very well how to play the right role. And perhaps that is why his story sounds so disturbing even today. There is another detail that can change the way we see Judas's entire story. Many people think his presence among the disciples was random, as if he just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But the Gospels tell a very different story. Before choosing the 12 disciples, Jesus did something very important. He went up the mountain and began to pray. The Gospel of Luke says he prayed all night, the whole night, not a few minutes, not a short prayer, all night, in silence, under the open sky, praying before making one of the most important choices of his ministry, because these 12 people were to be the ones who would carry his teaching into the world, those who would be with him every day, those who would witness his life most closely. And when morning came, Jesus chose the 12, not 11, 12. And among the 12 was Judas. This means his presence there was no accident. Judas did not simply join the group. Jesus himself chose him. And here arises a question that makes one think. Jesus knew. The Gospel of John says that once Jesus told his disciples, "Did I not choose the 12? Yet one of you is the devil." And he said this long before the betrayal, long before the silver coins, long before the Garden of Gethsemane. And yet Jesus allowed Judas to remain close. Day after day, year after year, 3 years. Judas heard the same sermons, saw the same miracles, ate the same bread, walked the same roads. Jesus did not push him away, did not expel him, did not humiliate him in front of others. On the contrary, he allowed him to be near, to hear, to see, to choose. And this brings us to a very important truth. True love never takes away freedom, even when that freedom can lead a person to make the wrong choice. Because love does not force, love offers, love calls, but the final choice always remains with the person. Judas saw things most people never saw. He was there when the storm suddenly calmed. He saw the blind begin to see. He was there when Jesus called Lazarus from the tomb. Lazarus had been dead for 4 days, but Jesus said, "Lazarus, come out." And the man already mourned came out alive. Judas saw this, and yet it did not change his heart, because miracles can amaze a person. But true change begins only when the heart is open. One day Judas went to the chief priests. He came quietly, without noise, without witnesses. It was not a random encounter. It was a decision long ripening in his heart. Judas looked at those who had long sought a way to get rid of Jesus. They could not seize him openly. The people loved him. They listened to his words, and any reckless move could spark a riot. But Judas knew what they did not. Betrayal from within. They agreed almost immediately. 30 pieces of silver, the price that could buy a slave at that time, the price of a human life in the ancient world. And for that price, Judas agreed to hand over the one who had walked with him for 3 years, the one with whom he had eaten at the same table, the one whose miracles he had seen with his own eyes. 30 pieces of silver. And so began one of the most infamous stories of betrayal in human history. But there is one detail many people miss. When Judas went to the Garden of Gethsemane, the night was already deep. Judas went ahead. He knew exactly where Jesus stood. He knew whom to point out. And the sign he chose for the soldiers was almost painfully simple. "Whomever I kiss, he is the one." A kiss, a sign of friendship, a sign of respect, a sign of closeness. Judas approached Jesus. Perhaps their eyes met for only a second. Perhaps that second felt like eternity. And then Judas leaned in and kissed him. At that moment, the soldiers were ready to seize Jesus, but Jesus looked at Judas and spoke only one word: friend, not enemy, not traitor, not you who sold me. Friend. A single word that sounds almost impossible in that moment, even now. Even in the moment of betrayal, even when everything is already decided. Jesus still calls him friend. And perhaps that is what makes this story even more painful. That same night, another disciple also denied Jesus. Peter. 3 times he said, I do not know him. 2 disciples, 2 falls, but 2 very different endings. When Peter realized what had happened, he wept bitterly. But later he returned to Jesus. Judas also realized his action. The gospel says he went back to the chief priests and said, I have sinned. I have betrayed innocent blood. He even returned the silver coins. But he made one fatal mistake. He did not go to Jesus. And here Judas's story becomes a true warning. Not just an ancient biblical story. Not just a tragedy of one man. It is a mirror in which anyone can see themselves. Because the difference between Peter and Judas was not in the sin. Both betrayed. Peter 3 times said he did not even know Jesus. Before people, before servants, before random witnesses by the fire. He swore, he denied, he disowned. Judas also betrayed. And from a human perspective, his sin seems worse. But the Bible shows something deeper. The difference between them was not only in the act. The difference was in direction, in the path a person takes after falling. When a person falls, there are almost always 2 paths before them. The first, to go away from God, to hide, to shut down, to convince yourself that it's all lost, to tell yourself, I've gone too far. It's too late for me. There's no way back for me. And there is a second path, to go to God, even if ashamed, even if afraid, even if it seems you do not deserve to lift your eyes. Peter ran to grace. He wept. He broke down. But he did not flee from Jesus forever. His heart still reached for him. Judas went the opposite way, his heart filled with despair. And instead of running toward mercy, he believed a lie. And perhaps the most dangerous thought a person can have is this: it's too late for me. A quiet thought, almost imperceptible. But it can close the heart more tightly than any sin. I've gone too far. God cannot forgive someone like me. My story is already over. But the Bible repeatedly shows something very different. Jesus forgave those who disowned him. He forgave Peter and made him one of the leaders of the early church. Jesus accepted those who doubted. Even when Thomas did not believe, Jesus did not reject him. He reached out his hands. And even on the cross, Jesus prayed for those who crucified him. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. This means one very important thing. As long as a person breathes, the way to God is not closed. As long as the heart can still respond, as long as a person can still say, God help me, hope is still alive. And so Judas's story is not just a story of betrayal, it is a story of warning. A warning about how dangerous it is to let despair speak louder than mercy. Because the greatest tragedy is not that people fall. People have always fallen. Kings have fallen. Prophets have fallen. Disciples have fallen. The greatest tragedy is when people stop believing they can return, when they stop believing in mercy, when they convince themselves the door is already closed, even though in reality it is still open. And perhaps even now that line passes through someone's heart, the line between despair and hope, the line between running away and returning, and sometimes a single small decision to return to God can change the whole story.